There is a moment when you know. You know the conversation you need to have. You know the project you need to start. You know the decision you've been avoiding. You know the first step. And yet, you still don't move. You tell yourself you'll do it tomorrow. You tell yourself you need more information, more confidence, more time, a better plan. And somehow, tomorrow keeps moving further away. But here's what most people don't understand. You are not always waiting for the right moment. Sometimes you're waiting for the fear to disappear. And that moment may never come. Because the truth is, you don't become ready and then take action. You take action. And that's how you become ready. Think about the last time you were standing at the edge of something important. Maybe you wanted to apply for the job, start the business, post the video, have the difficult conversation, go back to school, leave something that was holding you back, or finally become serious about a goal you've been talking about for months. You could see the destination. You could imagine how different your life might look. But then your mind started asking questions. What if I fail? What if people judge me? What if I'm not good enough? What if I make the wrong decision? What if I start and discover that I can't actually do it? And suddenly, the simple act of taking the first step feels enormous. So you wait, not because you don't care, but because you care so much that failure feels terrifying. And this is where the trap begins. You start believing that confidence must come before action, that certainty must come before commitment, that motivation must come before movement. But if you live by that rule, you'll spend years standing at the starting line, because confidence is rarely given to you in advance. Confidence is evidence. Every time you act, despite uncertainty, you give yourself evidence that you can trust yourself. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, you strengthen that trust. Every time you do something uncomfortable and survive it, your brain learns something important. Maybe I am capable of more than I thought. That's how confidence is built, not by sitting in your room thinking about how confident you want to become, not by waiting for some magical morning when fear suddenly disappears, but by moving while fear is still there. And this is the shift you need to make. Stop asking, "Do I feel ready?" Start asking, "What is the smallest thing I can do right now?" Because you don't need to conquer the entire mountain today. You need to take the next step. That's it. One page, one phone call, 10 minutes of work, one application, one uncomfortable conversation, one decision. Small action breaks the psychological wall that overthinking builds. Because hesitation grows when everything stays inside your head. You think about the goal. You imagine the consequences. You analyze every possible outcome. And the longer you think without moving, the larger the task becomes in your imagination. A small door starts looking like a wall, but the moment you move, something changes. You get information. You create momentum. You discover what actually needs to happen next. And suddenly, the thing that looked impossible becomes a series of smaller problems you can solve. That's why the first step matters so much. Not because it immediately changes your entire life, but because it changes your relationship with yourself. You go from being someone who thinks about action to someone who takes action. And that difference is enormous, because your identity is shaped by what you repeatedly do. If you repeatedly tell yourself, "I'll start tomorrow," you are teaching yourself that your own decisions are negotiable. But if you repeatedly say, "I'm doing this now," and then actually move, you're teaching yourself something completely different. You're teaching yourself, "I follow through." And eventually, that becomes part of who you are. This is why you shouldn't focus only on the size of the goal. Focus on the identity you're building through every small decision. When you choose to work for 20 minutes instead of scrolling for an hour, you're not just completing 20 minutes of work. You're becoming someone who can direct their attention. When you make the difficult phone call you've been avoiding, you're not just making a phone call. You're becoming someone who doesn't run from discomfort. When you begin before you feel confident, you're not just starting a project. You're becoming someone who doesn't require perfect conditions to move forward. And that person is dangerous to your old limitations. Because once you realize you can act without permission from your emotions, everything changes. You stop being controlled by whether you feel motivated. You stop waiting for the perfect mood. You stop negotiating with every uncomfortable feeling. You begin to understand something powerful. Feelings are information. They are not always instructions. Fear can tell you that something matters. Doubt can tell you that you're stepping into unfamiliar territory. Discomfort can tell you that you're growing. But none of those feelings automatically mean, stop. Sometimes they simply mean, this is new. And your brain is designed to prefer what is familiar. That's why the old routine can feel safer, even when it is making you unhappy. The familiar struggle feels predictable. The unfamiliar opportunity feels dangerous. So your mind creates reasons to stay where you are, not because it hates you, because it is trying to protect you from uncertainty. But protection and progress are not always the same thing. If you always choose what feels safest today, you may accidentally create a life that feels smaller tomorrow. So you have to learn to distinguish between genuine danger and emotional discomfort. Those are not the same thing. Being nervous before an important conversation does not mean you shouldn't have it. Feeling uncertain before starting something new does not mean you're incapable. Being uncomfortable while learning does not mean you're failing. Sometimes discomfort is simply the price of entering a new level of your life. And if you keep running from that feeling, you'll keep running from the opportunities attached to it. So what do you do when you don't feel ready? You lower the requirement. Don't demand confidence. Demand movement. Don't demand certainty. Demand one honest step. Don't demand that you know the entire path. Demand that you are willing to discover the next part. Because you can move without knowing everything. You can begin without having the perfect plan. You can learn while you're moving. In fact, that's how most meaningful progress happens. You don't receive the entire map before you begin the journey. You discover the road as you walk it. And this is where action becomes more powerful than overthinking. Overthinking gives you the illusion of progress. You feel like you're working on the problem because you're thinking about it constantly. But thinking is not the same as moving. You can spend 6 hours researching how to start something and still be standing in exactly the same place. At some point, preparation becomes another form of avoidance. You don't need another 100 answers. You need one experiment. Try something. Learn from it. Adjust. Try again. That's how uncertainty becomes clarity. Action creates information, and information creates better action. You cannot think your way into knowing everything. You have to interact with reality. Send the email. Make the call. Publish the first version. Ask the question. Take the class. Start the workout. Open the document. Do the thing. And then let reality teach you what comes next. This is how you stop treating readiness as a feeling and start treating it as a process. You become ready by doing. You become confident by proving things to yourself. You become disciplined by practicing follow-through. You become courageous by repeatedly choosing movement over avoidance. And you become the person you keep imagining by behaving like that person before you completely believe you are them. So the next time your mind says, "I'm not ready yet," don't fight it. Don't spend 20 minutes trying to convince yourself that you're fearless. Just answer with a better question. Ready or not, what can I do in the next 10 minutes? Then do that. Because 10 minutes of action can teach you more than an hour of hesitation. And once you move, don't underestimate what happens next. Momentum begins quietly. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It starts with one decision, one small action, one moment where you could have returned to the old pattern, but didn't, and then another, and another. Until one day you look back and realize you didn't suddenly become fearless. You simply stopped allowing fear to make every decision for you. That is the real transformation. Not becoming a person who never feels afraid, becoming a person who can feel fear and move anyway. Because your life does not change when you finally feel ready. Your life changes when you decide that being unready is no longer an excuse to remain still. But there's another reason people stay stuck. They think the problem is motivation. It's not. The deeper problem is that they've trained themselves to obey resistance. You feel tired, so you stop. You feel uncertain, so you hesitate. You feel afraid, so you retreat. You feel uncomfortable, so you distract yourself. And every time you respond that way, you're teaching your brain the same lesson. Discomfort means escape. But here's the part that changes everything. Every time you stay with the discomfort and take action anyway, you're teaching your brain something completely different. You're teaching it, I can feel resistance and still move. That's how you build a different response. Think about two people facing the exact same difficult task. Both are nervous. Both have doubts. Both feel unprepared. One says, "I'll do it when I feel better." The other says, "I don't need to feel better. I just need to begin." That small difference can create completely different lives, because one person lets emotion make the decision. The other lets their decision determine their behavior. And this is why you cannot build your life around how you feel in the moment. Your emotions will change. Your standards shouldn't have to. There will be days when you feel motivated. There will be days when you don't. There will be moments when you believe in yourself completely. And there will be moments when your mind questions everything. If your actions depend entirely on your emotional state, your progress will always be inconsistent. You'll move when you feel good and disappear when you don't. Instead, build a standard. I show up even when the feeling isn't perfect. Not because you have to become some emotionless machine, because you need to become someone you can rely on. And that starts much smaller than you think. Don't promise yourself you'll completely transform your life tomorrow. Promise yourself you'll take the next step today. If you say you'll spend 20 minutes on something, spend 20 minutes. If you say you'll make the call, make the call. If you say you'll study, study. If you say you'll start today, start today. Every time you keep one of these promises, you're building something more valuable than temporary motivation. You're building self-trust. And self-trust changes the way you see yourself. Imagine knowing that when you tell yourself you're going to do something, you actually do it. You don't need someone constantly pushing you. You don't need perfect circumstances. You don't need to feel inspired every morning. You know that when you decide to move, you move. That is real confidence. Not the confidence of knowing everything will work out. The confidence of knowing you'll handle yourself even when it doesn't. And that's an important distinction. Taking action doesn't mean pretending nothing can go wrong. It doesn't mean ignoring risk. It doesn't mean convincing yourself that failure is impossible. Real courage is much more practical than that. You can recognize the risk and still move. You can be afraid and still prepare. You can know you might fail and still try. Because the goal isn't certainty. The goal is becoming comfortable with uncertainty. There is no guarantee. Not in business, not in your career, not in relationships, not in your dreams. You can plan carefully and still face rejection. You can work hard and still make mistakes. You can give something your best effort and discover that it wasn't the right path. But failure gives you something hesitation never can: information. A failed attempt can show you what doesn't work. It can reveal what you need to improve. It can point you toward a better strategy. And sometimes, it teaches you something even more important. You can fall and get back up. The person who never acts because they might fail doesn't actually eliminate failure. They simply exchange visible failure for invisible regret. And regret has a way of becoming heavier with time. You start asking, what if I had tried? What if I had started? What if I had trusted myself? So when you're standing at that crossroads, don't only ask, what happens if I fail? Ask, what happens if I never try? What does another year of hesitation look like? Another year of saying, I'll start soon. Another year of waiting for confidence. Another year of knowing you're capable of more, but never finding out what you're actually capable of. Sometimes the greater risk isn't taking action. Sometimes it's staying exactly where you are. And once you understand that, your question changes. You stop asking, how do I get rid of fear? It simply stops being the one making your decisions. But now here's where things get real. Understanding why you procrastinate is one thing. Knowing you should take action is another. But actually taking action when your mind is screaming, don't do it? That's the skill you need to build. Because fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like procrastination, overthinking, researching one more strategy, watching one more video, telling yourself you're preparing, when deep down, you're avoiding the moment when preparation has to become action. So here's the rule. When you catch yourself overthinking, make the next action smaller. Don't try to solve your entire future. Solve the next 5 minutes. Ask yourself, what can I physically do right now that moves this forward? Not think about. Not plan. Do. Open the document. Write the first sentence. Make the call. Record the first 30 seconds. Take the first step. Because your job right now isn't to transform your entire life. Your job is to create movement. And movement creates information. Once you move, you'll discover what works, what doesn't, what needs to change, and then you can adjust. That's how progress actually happens. Action to feedback, to adjustment to more action. Not perfect plan to perfect confidence, to perfect execution. That version doesn't exist. Real progress is messy. You move, you make mistakes, you learn, you adjust, and you move again. But there's another skill you need. You have to learn how to separate discomfort from danger. Your brain often treats them like the same thing. You feel nervous and think, this is a bad idea. You feel uncomfortable and think, maybe I'm not ready. But discomfort isn't always a warning to stop. Sometimes it's simply the feeling of doing something unfamiliar. Your brain prefers what it already knows, even when what it knows isn't helping you. That's why change can feel wrong at first. You're leaving a familiar pattern, and your brain says, come back. Not necessarily because the old life is better, because it's familiar. Remember this. Familiar doesn't mean right, and uncomfortable doesn't mean wrong. Sometimes discomfort is simply the price of growth. The first time you do something difficult, it feels unnatural, but repetition changes the experience. You do it again and again. Eventually, your brain learns, this is what we do now. You don't eliminate fear. You reduce its authority. You don't need a life where you never feel nervous. You need a life where nervousness doesn't control your decisions. So the next time fear shows up, don't ask, how do I make this feeling disappear? Ask, can I take the next step while feeling this? Fear doesn't have to leave. It just has to come with you. Sometimes that's what courage really is. Now here's something that can completely change your ability to take action. Create a deadline that doesn't depend on your mood. If your plan is, I'll do it when I feel motivated, you've already handed control to your emotions, and emotions change. Instead, create a simple rule. Every day at 7 p.m., I work on this for 20 minutes. You don't have to feel motivated. You don't have to feel inspired. You just show up. This removes one of procrastination's biggest problems, the daily negotiation. Because every time you ask yourself whether you're going to do something, your brain gets another opportunity to say, maybe tomorrow. I'm tired. I'll do twice as much tomorrow. And suddenly, another day disappears. So don't negotiate with a decision you've already made. If something matters, Build it into your routine. Make the beginning automatic. And sometimes, make the commitment even smaller. Tell yourself, I only have to do 10 minutes. 10 minutes isn't intimidating. You don't need heroic motivation. You just need to begin. Because starting is often the hardest part. That's why the goal isn't always to finish. Sometimes the goal is simply, start. Start badly. Start nervously. Start imperfectly. But start. Because you can improve something that exists. You can't improve something you never created. You can edit a first draft. You can't edit a blank page. You can improve a business after launching it. You can't improve an idea that never leaves your head. Your first action doesn't need to be impressive. It needs to be real. And when you take that first real action, something even more important happens. You begin rebuilding trust with yourself. Every time you tell yourself, I'm going to do this, and then don't, your brain notices. Repeated broken promises teach you, I don't follow through. And once you believe that about yourself, taking action becomes harder. So start rebuilding that trust. Make smaller promises, then keep them. Don't promise yourself 5 hours if you've been struggling with 20 minutes. Promise 20 minutes, and keep it. Now you've taken the first step, but here's where many people make another mistake. They take action once, and expect their life to change immediately. One productive day, one workout, one early morning, one day working on the project. And then they wonder, why don't I feel different yet? Because one action creates movement. Repeated action creates momentum. Think about pushing a heavy object. The first push is the hardest. There's resistance. But once it starts moving, keeping it moving becomes easier. Your life can work the same way. When you've been stuck for a long time, even simple things can feel difficult. Starting feels difficult. Focusing feels difficult. Making decisions feels difficult. Not because you're incapable. You may simply be living without momentum. And momentum isn't built through one massive burst of motivation. It's built through small wins. One completed task. One promise kept. One uncomfortable conversation. One workout. One page. One decision. Each one gives your brain evidence, I'm moving. And eventually, you stop asking, do I feel like doing this? You start asking, what's next? That's a major shift. You're no longer allowing your emotions to decide whether your goals deserve your attention. And that's why consistency matters more than intensity. You don't need to give 100% every day. Some days you'll have everything. Other days, maybe only 30%. That's okay. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is continuity. Because a person who takes imperfect action for a year will usually go further than someone who performs perfectly for 3 days and disappears. Small actions repeated long enough become habits. Habits repeated long enough become identity. And once action becomes part of your identity, you don't have to fight yourself as much to do it. You don't keep saying, I need to become disciplined. You become someone who keeps commitments. You don't keep saying, I need to become confident. You become someone who does difficult things. The identity follows the evidence. So stop trying to convince yourself that you're a different person. Give yourself evidence. Every day. And remember one powerful rule. Never miss twice. You're going to have bad days. You'll lose focus. You'll procrastinate. You'll choose comfort sometimes. That's human. The problem isn't missing once. The problem is turning one missed day into a new identity. You skip one workout. Then you think, I've already messed up. So you skip another, then another, and suddenly, one bad day becomes a month. Don't do that. If you fall off, return quickly. If you make a mistake, correct it. If you lose momentum, rebuild it. You don't need to punish yourself. You simply need to resume. Because consistency isn't about never falling. It's about becoming someone who knows how to return. And that is a much stronger form of discipline. Be careful about how you talk to yourself after failure. Don't say, I always quit. I'm lazy. I'll never change. Those aren't just descriptions. You're reinforcing an identity. Instead, I miss today. Tomorrow I return. That didn't work. I'll adjust. I made a mistake. I can learn from it. You're not pretending everything is perfect. You're refusing to turn one mistake into a permanent label. Your future doesn't require a perfect record. It requires you to keep returning to the path. Eventually, something changes. The actions that once required enormous mental effort begin to feel normal. You don't need a motivational speech. You don't need to convince yourself for 30 minutes. You simply start. Why? Because you've practiced starting so many times that your brain recognizes the pattern. That's what you're really building, not motivation. A response. When discomfort appears, you respond with action. When fear appears, you respond with action. When you don't feel ready, you take the smallest, useful step. And over time, that becomes automatic. But there's another piece most people overlook: your environment. If your phone is beside you every time you work, you're making action harder. If distractions surround you, you're asking willpower to fight a battle. It doesn't need to fight. Make the right action easier. Put your phone away. Prepare your workspace. Keep what you need ready. Write down tomorrow's most important task before you sleep. Reduce the friction, because every unnecessary obstacle gives your brain another opportunity to choose comfort. You don't need to become someone who fights themselves all day. You need to build a life where moving forward becomes easier. That's momentum. And momentum changes how you see yourself. At first, I'm trying to become disciplined. Then, I'm becoming disciplined. Eventually, I am disciplined. At first, I'm trying to take action. Eventually, I'm someone who takes action. That final shift is powerful, because when action becomes part of your identity, you stop depending on motivation. You don't need to feel inspired to be yourself. You simply behave according to who you've decided to become. So ask yourself, who would I become if I stopped negotiating with myself? So now you know the truth. You don't need to feel ready. You don't need perfect confidence. And you don't need to know exactly how everything will work out. You need to move. Because the life you want isn't waiting for some magical moment when fear disappears. It's being built through the decisions you make while fear is still there. Maybe you've been waiting for a sign, for someone to tell you you're capable, for circumstances to become easier. But what if the right time isn't something you find? What if it's something you create? Today doesn't have to be the day your entire life changes. It only has to be the day you stop standing still. The real question isn't, will I succeed? You can't know that yet. It's, am I willing to take the next step anyway? Because action doesn't require certainty. It requires commitment. Commitment means continuing when the excitement disappears, continuing when nobody is watching, continuing when results are slow, continuing when the first attempt doesn't work. You don't control every circumstance. You don't control what other people think. You don't control how quickly results arrive. But you do control your next action. And sometimes that's enough. So stop trying to control your entire future. Control the next hour, the next decision, the next step. When you don't know what to do, ask yourself, what's one thing I can do right now that my future self will thank me for? Maybe whatever it is, make it an action. Not another thought, not another plan. An action. Because your future self doesn't need another promise. It needs evidence that you started. And imagine meeting that future version of yourself 1 year from now. You could look back and say, I was afraid, but I started. I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but I learned. I failed sometimes, but I came back. I didn't feel ready, but I moved anyway. Or you could realize that another year passed while you were waiting for a feeling that never came. That's the choice in front of you. not perfection versus failure, movement versus staying stuck. Every small decision is teaching you who you are. When you repeatedly say, "I'll do it later," you're teaching yourself that your goals can wait. But when you say, "I'll take the next step now," you're teaching yourself that your commitments matter. Eventually, that becomes your identity. That's why taking action when you don't feel ready is so powerful. You're not just completing a task, you're training yourself to handle discomfort, move without certainty, and trust yourself. You don't become fearless, you become capable. And capable people still get nervous. They still doubt themselves. They still fail. The difference is they don't treat those feelings as a reason to stop. So when you fail, don't ask, "What's wrong with me?" Ask, "What can I learn from this?" When you're afraid, ask, "What can I do while I'm afraid?" When you don't feel motivated, ask, "What's the smallest useful thing I can do anyway?" And when you fall behind, "How can I return today?" Because motivation comes and goes. A decision can remain. Don't let this become just another video you watched. Let it become the moment you acted. Information changes what you know. Action changes what you experience. And experience changes who you become. You don't become confident first. You become confident because you keep moving. You don't become disciplined first. You become disciplined because you keep your promises. You don't become ready first. You become ready because you begin. So start uncertain. Start imperfect. Start scared. Start with 5 minutes. Start with one step. But start. Because your future isn't asking you to be fearless. It's asking you to begin. And if this message reached you at a moment when you've been waiting, overthinking, or doubting yourself, don't leave this video with motivation alone. Leave with a decision. Write one thing you're going to do today in the comments. Then go do it. Your next chapter doesn't begin when you feel ready. It begins when you decide to move.